Hey guys, welcome back to the second clip in this series. Carrying on from the first one, we have put some template code in place, and now we need to sort of flesh this out. We need to build this function and really get in the functionality that we expect, right? We ultimately are moving towards being able to put a file in S3, have Lambda execute, and get our resized image. So let's get somewhere with that. So with what we currently have, we've sort of just taken this from the documentation. We haven't really tested it out, so we should probably just test it out to make sure that as we build our function that it works at each step of the way, right? So what I've done is I've got a Cat3 JPEG picture. You can get any picture you like. Yeah, why not work with cats in this sense? So what I've got here is I'm going to just use this picture as the input. So Cat3 JPEG, we're going to use that. We're going to resize this and put it into our folder here. So at the moment, if we ran this, it would return to us a buffer and it would just say done. It wouldn't really do anything for us. So we need to change this up a little bit, and just to test if it works, what we're going to do is we're going to import the file system. So FS is a module that we can use to interact with the file system. So I'm going to call this FS here, and I'm going to say that if there's an error, let's say if there's an error, we'll just console.log this error. So console.log error. And else, what we'll do is we'll call the FS, so we'll call the file system module, we'll just say fs.writeFile, and what we'll do here, and this is what I love about VS Code as well, if you actually just mouse over write file here, it'll give us all the information we need. So you can see we need to give it a path first, and then we can give it the data. And I can see here that write file takes a buffer as well. So I can give it a buffer, which is great because we're actually producing a buffer when we take this image. So all I need to do is just give it a path. So we'll just give it a local path. So let's just say cat3 resize, and that's fine. We'll call that JPEG as well. And then all we'll do is we'll give this the buffer. And then what we're going to do is give it a callback function so that we can actually write out that it's finished. So console.log complete, right? So that should work. We should be able to write that file out from that incoming buffer that we've got. So let's just run this now and have a look if this works. So if we just open up the command line and we just type in node, right, because we're using Node.js, type in node and index and then run that, we see complete. And then if we jump back over to VS Code, we can see now we have Cat3 resize. So if we click that, we can see it's a lot smaller. So it's definitely resized this image into 100 by 100, which is what we have as our static sort of resize properties here. Great, so we know that everything's working as intended. So let's clear that up and go back to where we were. So now we have a better idea of what to do. We know that our FS file write, or our write, allows us to pass in a buffer, and so does our S3 put. When we have a look shortly, you'll be able to see that you can actually pass a buffer into put object as part of S3, and that will put it into S3. Because when you actually read an item from S3, you get back a buffer as well, because items can be very large, so you want to get back a buffer in that sense. So now what we're going to do is start to work on the S3 aspect of this a little bit more. So we're going to actually open up our controllers file and go over here. And what we're going to do is we're going to flesh this out a little bit. We're going to import the AWS SDK. So the first thing we're going to do is just a const, and we'll just say AWS equals require AWS SDK. And we should probably install that before we go too far. So npm install AWS SDK, and that will work. Okay, and then we're just going to ensure it's there by having a look in our package.json. You can see that it is now a dependency. So with the AWS SDK, I never really want to pass in credentials. I never want to be able to put something in there, right? I always want the credentials to be implied from my current session, or implied from the EC2 instance that it's running on, or implied from the Lambda function that has access to do that sort of stuff, right? We call that a role in AWS. So Lambda is going to have a role, and what it's going to be able to do is be able to access S3. So it's going to be able to get from S3, and it's going to be able to put from S3. So that's going to be part of the policy that is assigned to the role that the function executes as. As we're going to be playing with this locally though here, the account that I have is going to have access to put and to get from S3. Actually running my own AWS account, and of course you can as well. It's free for the first year. You get access to the free tier, and all of Lambda, all of S3, you know, just at a basic usage level, it's all free. So really, if you haven't checked that out, do that, and then continue this. But if you have an AWS account, jump in there and set up just a basic access for yourself that will allow yourself to have get access from S3 and put access to S3. And essentially all you're going to need are two buckets, right? Just the first bucket is going to be just some normal original upload, and then we're going to have a resize bucket as well. So what I'd like to do first is just take a look at the S3 documentation for JavaScript. So we can just open that up. So here's the documentation for S3 as part of the JavaScript SDK. And first of all, you'll see a couple of things here. This is essentially one thing that you'll need to take in, and another way of doing that is like this. This is probably the better way. So what we're going to do is we're going to copy and paste this over, because what this is going to do is set our API version, which is really important. We need to set an API version. If there's no version set, it doesn't work. So you need to actually explicitly say, I want to use this version of the API. So what we'll do is we'll copy this into our project, just like that. And you can also pass in other API versions here. So say if I was using DynamoDB or whatever, I could put that in here and specify that API version also. But we're not going to be using anything else, so let's clear that. I'm going to change this to a constant because we're using ES6. And also what I'm going to do is specify a region. So I want to specify a region. So if we just say AWS region, I have that saved as a snippet. So we can just say this is going to be EU West. Right? And this means that the function is explicitly said to be in a certain region. It's only going to work in that region when we actually access the S3 SDK. So we're using the AWS SDK here, but we're accessing the S3 components. And I want to just say, hey, make sure that if you're doing anything, update the config to say that it's using the EU West region. Now, even though S3 is a global service, it's still important to specify a default region as such. Otherwise, later on when there's services that are not globally available, like they're locked to a certain region as such, you'll need to sort of start specifying the region. That can be a little bit tricky. So it's always better to just explicitly say, hey, I'm working with this region. And if you're doing multi-region, that's great. You can add that configuration into your application to swap regions as needed. So now we have a new variable here called S3, which is creating a new AWS S3 object. And of course, the mapping here is AWS is the actual SDK up the top here, which you can see, and S3 is the component that we actually want to access out of that. So now that's in S3 here. So jumping back to the documentation, we should have a look at the put command. So if we do a put object, we can see here we have put object. We can get the information about how this works. So you can see right here that it's simply just a put object. So it just takes the parameters just like that. And that's all you need. So we'll just take that over and we'll have a look at this. So there's a lot of stuff here we don't really need. We're not going to need in any sort of tagging. We won't work with server-side encryption just yet. We'll leave the body as an empty string for now, just like that. And the bucket and the key are things we need to pass in. That's important. And that's the actual outcome that we're going to get there. We don't need this. We'll just remove some of these comments and clean it up a little bit. And of course, again, ES6 function styling. So we should do this. Makes a bit more sense for us. Now, okay, so we're starting to put in a little bit of code. Let's start wrapping this up in a bit more logical sense. Let's put this inside a function. So I'm going to put this inside a function, and I'm going to call it put object. Now, this might be a little bit confusing because we actually have the same name down here, but this makes a little bit of sense when you think about it. We're going to be calling this function later on. I'm going to be calling it outside this file. So I'm going to have to export this function and import it into my index.js. So to do that, I want to give it a name that's very similar to what it's actually going to be doing. Also with this object, I'm not going to use it in its current sense. I'm going to actually return a promise from this, and we'll go through why and how that works right now. So here I say put object, and I'm going to make this a anonymous function, so just like this. But of course, it's going to take in some parameters, right? Because these body, bucket, and key are all going to be parameters that I want to pass in. So let's say that body, bucket, and key, right? So we're going to pass those in from the main file, from the index.js. So that means that this becomes body. So that's looking a little bit better. But let's say that I want to return a new promise. So here, what we're saying is we actually, whenever this function is called, I want this whole function to return a promise when it completes. And what we're going to do with the promise is we're going to be able to chain them together and sort of give our function a nice sort of visual synchronous pattern, even though certain aspects of it will run asynchronously. This is one of those ways to avoid what they call callback hell, right? A callback hell is where you have multiple nested callbacks. I have another video on this if you're interested in what that looks like. But essentially, you want to avoid multiple call stacks, right? So where you have a callback, and then that calls another function, which calls a callback, which calls another function, which calls a callback. And then, because you're working with three sort of different levels of scoping there, it can become very sort of complicated quickly. So that's where promises sort of come in. If you haven't heard of them, I also have a video on promises. It's quite old now, so I want to sort of revamp it a little bit in this tutorial. There's a bunch of reading you can do about how they work as well. It makes it so much easier from a readability point of view, and it makes it easier to sort of chain asynchronous commands together as well. So it's really, really cool in that sense. So in my promise here, I'm going to take two parameters. So one is always resolve, and one is always reject, right? So I either want to resolve that promise and say, yes, it's good, or I want to reject that promise and say it's bad. So what I'm going to do now is that those are going to be my actual parameters that I pass in. Let's just fix this up. And inside this promise, I'm going to dump all of this file in, right? So just like that. So now we've moved all of that inside that promise. So you can see here, that's the scope here. So I'm going to have, again, these parameters going to be here, passed in nicely. But now I'm not going to console.log anything. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say reject, and I'm going to reject the promise with the error if there is an error while putting that object into S3. Else, what I'm going to do is resolve with the data that comes out from putting that file into S3. So we're going to have the params here, which are passed in as the first argument, which are right here. And we'll tab that over and we'll change this to a const. Makes it a bit nicer. And then we're going to have, here's our S3 put object. And that's going to take an error, of course. So if there is an error, the whole promise gets rejected. So this here will be rejected right here with the error information. Else it's going to resolve it with the data that comes out of the put object command. So this is a little bit messy, so we can clean a little bit of this up, and we'll put some linting in later, right? ESLint has a really, really nice way of wrapping linting and making your project a lot cleaner, so we'll put that in later. Okay, so that looks good for just our put object. So what we can do is a module.exports, and we can export that function. So it's just going to be put object. So what that's going to do is allow it to be imported into our index.js file. So now jumping back over to our index.js, if we just do const and we just say S3, and we can just say require. So all we need to do now is just pass in that file path. So if we just say controllers and S3, just like that, now we have access to S3. So if you say S3 dot, you can see that put object comes up straight away because that's been exported from that controller, and now we can use it in our index.js file. So to wrap up this video and move on to the next one, what I want to quickly do is just write this buffer into S3. So you can see here where we have our to buffer. Let's just get rid of this, and we'll just say if error, we'll just say console.log this error again. So we'll say console.log this error. And then we can say else, and we also need to close this off, of course, like this, keep it nice and neat. And then we can say else, and we can just say s3.putObject, and this, remember, takes a couple of values, right? So it takes the body, first of all, which is going to be the buffer, right? And then it's going to take the bucket. So the bucket name I'm going to use in this is just going to be called Flynn bucket resize. So if we just do an AWS S3 ls Flynn bucket resize, you can see I have nothing in there. The bucket's completely empty. So the bucket is there and it exists, but it is empty. So I'm going to dump a file into that just to test that this all works as intended. So let's say Flynn bucket resize. Okay, and then the key, so the actual name of the file that I want to dump in there is going to be, let's just say cat3.jpg. Let's just say -resize, right? So we're actually going to take the buffer into put object. We're going to take the bucket name and also the output or the key that's going to come out of that. So that should appear in our file, in our bucket, and we should be able to grab that after it's been resized. So let's just run this now. So we can do a node index. And as you can see now, we have the cat3 resize. So you can see that's actually worked as intended. So we didn't actually put any sort of fancy thing on the output of that to say that it's been done, but we can see that our file is now sitting in there and it's ready to roll. So here's the file here. Cool, so that's working as intended. We're able to take that image from the buffer and actually put it into S3 with our promise. And we'll go through a bit why we did it in a promise shortly. You'll be able to see as we start to chain this all together, how much easier and more simplistic it looks. But that's it for this one. We'll jump into the next video and we'll talk about getting the object out of the original bucket, processing it, and then using the put to put it into the new bucket.